But I thank you. So I want to talk about origins in early life, and you telling us about your upbringing and the values that was instilled in you by your family while growing up here in Charlotte.
Well, of course, when I talk about growing up in Charlotte, I tell people I consider myself a Charlottean, even though we moved here when I was 4 years old.
Hmm.
Of course, my father was a Presbyterian minister, but not only, he was an educator as well. So we moved to Charlotte from Knoxville, Tennessee, and my father was when we were in Knoxville, my father was doing missionary work for the Presbyterian Church. My father was a graduate of Johnson C. Smith. He graduated from here in 1934 as an undergrad, and then graduated from the seminary here in 1936.
Was it a seminary here on
The
campus?
seminary was here on Smith's campus.
Okay.
And the seminary was here on Smith's campus up until the maybe late 60s. And then it moved to Atlanta, and it became the interdenominational seminary in Atlanta. So here, the seminary here was for Presbyterian ministers,
Okay.
those that wanted to pursue, the Presbyterian Church as a minister.
Can you say your father's name?
Herman L. Counts Sr. And so that's why we moved to Charlotte, because of that. I mean, he had roots as, a former student of the university. But education-wise, for him and my mother, started at an early age. And I guess that's one of the reasons why the four of us had just strong, I would say, background or some love for education, because that's all we heard as kids growing up.
Yeah.
My father was from South Carolina, and he moved to North Carolina, to a little town called Rowland, North Carolina, which is between Lumberton and Laurinburg. And the reason why the family moved there was because which was his stepfather, but we considered him our grandfather because that's the only person we ever knew, because my grandmother married him when my dad was 8 years old.
Okay.
So he raised my father. And they moved to Rowland because they were traveling from South Carolina to Lumberton, North Carolina for a job that he had been offered as a barber. When they got to Rowland, they stopped to get gas, and they were sitting there in the gas station, and this white man walked up to the car, and he looked in the car. My father's mother was very, very fair. Her sister passed for white back in those days. So my grandfather was part African American and American Indian. Mm-hmm. He was dark complexion but very sharp features with straight black hair. So he's looking at this couple sitting in the car, children in the back seat, and he says to them, "Where are you going?" And my grandfather said to him, "I am going to Lumberton because I have been offered a job as a barber." And so he said, "Well, we need a barber here. How much are they paying you in Lumberton?" And of course, my grandfather told him, "Well, if we pay you, for example, 50 cents more,
right,
would you move here? And we'll set the barbershop up for you. It'll be on the main street. But you have to understand that the barbershop will only be for white residents."
Now, when you first started saying this, I knew it was going to get wicked, but I didn't know it was going to go there.
Right.
Wow.
And so naturally, my grandfather, was looking out for his family. They were going to pay him more money. Not only that, they told him that they would provide him a place to live, open up the business for him, set up the barbershop for him on the main street,
right,
there in Rowland. Rowland was a very small town. no business. And most of the people who lived in Roland either picked cotton, worked in tobacco, or farmed. The blacks that lived there naturally worked on the farms of the white residents who had farms in that area.
As from a sharecropping perspective?
Yes.
Okay.
So grandma and granddaddy got a house. He's got a business. My grandmother was a seamstress. So they moved them into a house 2 blocks from downtown on the street. But it was an area primarily where blacks lived. Okay? So granddad opened up the barbershop. Grandmother opened up, she started sewing, but she only sewed for the white residents that lived in that area. So that's the kind of environment that my dad and his stepbrother
Yeah.
and sisters grew up in that environment.
Did they ever mention, even though they were doing work to make money predominantly for white folks, did they also perhaps on the side do things within the black community as well?
And I'm going to get to that point.
Okay.
So as children growing up, we went there during the summers because of the fact that my father was working on his advanced degrees, and so he'd go away during the summer to do that. And so naturally, they shipped the children down to the grandparents.
Yep.
And so for me, I was the only girl in my family. Naturally, I didn't do anything. My brothers would go out and they would work and do things in the community and stuff like that, the small community that it was. Or somebody would come by and say, well, Mr. Ed's children, why don't you come on go, and we're going to go pick watermelons today, those kinds of things, okay. But they weren't actually doing it for money. They were just going out to have something to do during the day. So what happened with my grandparents, naturally, they did not have the education that eventually their children got.
Sure.
But that was a focus, to make sure that their children were educated so they didn't have to go through and do some of the things that they did growing up. So I had an uncle in a little town called Cheraw, South Carolina.
Yeah, that's where Dizzy Gillespie's from.
Exactly. And that was my mother's aunt and uncle who lived in Cheraw. And they opened up a school for black kids. He was a Presbyterian minister also, and also finished Johnson C. Smith.
Okay.
And he opened up this school in Cheraw, and it was called Coulter Academy. Because when my father and those were growing up, you have to remember, young kids those days didn't go to school past the 8th grade. The schools were like 1st through 8th, and everybody was in the same classroom. And that was because when you passed the 8th grade, then that's when you would go out and work in the fields, pick cotton, and work for, the white folk in the town.
Right.
My grandparents didn't want that experience for their children. So when my father, after he finished the 8th grade, they shipped him off and his younger sister off to Cheraw to Coulter Academy for Aunt Lily and Uncle Walter's school. So then that's where they finished high school. Because Uncle Walter was a Presbyterian minister, had finished Johnson C. Smith, naturally he was feeding kids to Johnson C. Smith because that's where he graduated.
Most definitely, yeah.
Right.
It's a pipeline.
And Johnson C. Smith was also a Presbyterian school.
Right.
My mother grew up in Charleston. Her background was a little different in that her father was a fisherman had his own boat. And then her grandfather was also a carpenter. He built homes for all of his children, and they lived next door to each other.
Man, and what are the surnames connected to that side? Do you remember?
Wilson.
Wilson.
And
Okay.
That was my mother's maiden name, was Wilson.
What's her whole name?
Olethea. Olethea. Wilson. Elvita Wilson.
Mhm.
And so they lived in Charleston. So when you think in terms of, my mother was born in 1911. So you think in terms of back in those days, for a black man to have a boat, and he'd go out, and, fisherman. He was a fisherman. And yes, he used that money he got from that to help raise his family. But then his father was the one who was a carpenter and built homes
Yeah.
for his children.
Did from a dialect standpoint, was the Gullah dialect something that your mother ever?
No,
Okay.
because my mother lived 2 blocks. Their house was 2 blocks from the Battery in Charleston.
Mhm.
So see, the background of my mother and father were different.
Yeah.
And my mother's family, there was my younger brother did an ancestry background on my mother's family and went back 9 generations.
Mm.
In my mother's family, there were no slaves. And when you think about that, being Charleston, which is a port, you would think that she would have slaves in her family. But what it was is the original generation in my mother's family, her great-great-great-grandfather brought this woman from Jamaica as a freed woman.
Okay.
So that's why there are no slaves. So when
And you take
look-
on the status of the mother, right? And so the children that she had wouldn't necessarily be part of the chattel enslavement
Exactly,
process.
exactly. And so when you look at my mother's side of the family, the complexion of them were very fair, straight hair, because they were mixed.
Yep.
Okay, and growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, there was a lot of that.
Yeah.
So my mother, when she got ready to go to, my mother ended up going to school in Charleston, and it was an Episcopal school, and because they were Episcopalians. But when she got ready to go to high school, they sent her and her sister to Coulter Academy
Up
to
there.
be with her aunt and her uncle.
Are there any? Is the building still there? Coulter
No.
Academy. Okay.
No,
Because this seems like it's a very tight woven understanding that there's this direct pipeline from these black communities that could potentially lead to Johnson C. Smith University. So that's your road to higher education.
I think they have a marker there now.
Okay.
Frederick, I think that of the school, because my uncle's house was directly across the street from the school.
Okay.
He was also the minister of the Presbyterian Church, which still exists today, the Second Presbyterian Church in Charleston on 2nd Street, which is the main street that you go through. If you can go to Myrtle Beach, you can go through Charleston. And their home was across the street. And I remember that as a child, going to visit them with my parents. And the house that they lived in, I thought it was a mansion.
Mm.
It was a big brick house, 2-story house. My uncle drove a great big black car. I don't know what, to me, but anyway, so they mom and dad met at Coulter.
Wow.
as in high school. My dad came on, when he graduated from Colton, he came to Johnson C. Smith. My mother, when she graduated, she went to Scotia, which is now Barber Scotia.
Yeah.
And
Who
that was
are now who've settled their financial debts now,
right.
And they're going to be looking good here pretty soon. I hope.
Exactly. Right. So she went, but it was called Scotia College there for women.
Yes.
And it was only 2 years. So she went to Scotia. Dad came to Johnson C. Smith. So you can see the pipeline for my family in terms of the education piece, because growing up, that's all we knew.
That's all you knew.
Because at least back in those days, we could look at family members in terms of pursuing a higher education.
It wasn't because I feel oftentimes when people talk about our history that it's centered on pain points only.
Mm-hmm.
And what I tell people all the time is that there were free communities of color. There were people that did have the business acumen to build, right, wealth. And so when it's blanketed, the story of the beginnings of Black folks, that it's just very sad, and I mean, of course there's elements to it.
And they don't want to talk about
sure,
the past.
because of how it right. But
exactly.
when we talk about those positive things, right, like you mentioned, there was a side of your family in South Carolina that was freed, that was living as free people of color. I have the exact same thing. My James Scott was a free person of color out of Charleston. He was a fiddler. But that initiates a sense of empowerment that a young mind could absorb versus the swan story that people usually try to, impede only. And so I'm so glad to hear that, in which I wouldn't expect anything different, you as being as educated as you are about your family, knowing it from a comprehensive standpoint versus just a singular story that most people try to give our stories, our narratives.
Well, now I'm going to go back to my father's side of the family. And the question that you ask in terms of the things that they did in the community. Over the years, my grandparents became very much involved in the Black community, which was small. My father's sister, who came to Johnson C. Smith, graduated from Johnson C. Smith, went back to the community and became a teacher. Now, you've heard of Robeson County. That's where Roland is.
Yep.
So in Robeson County, you have white, Black, and Lumbee Indians. So she, of course, went back and taught in Black schools and Roland until she retired. My father's other sister left, went to Maryland, went to nursing school, and she became a nurse. My father's brother went in the military, and he left, and he went in the military. They went north, the two oldest. And my father had a half-sister who moved to New York. So they went north. But over the years, my grandparents were very well respected by the whites in that community. I don't know whether it was because my grandfather cut their hair, my grandmother made their clothes, but my grandfather was referred to by him as Mr. Ed. He was never addressed as boy or any kind of negative term, racist term. The same way with my grandmother. They called her Miss Emily. So as years passed, I saw my aunt who moved back. She got more involved in the community. They were very much involved in the church because, back in those days, the church was your foundation. So they were involved she got involved in the church. She ended up being on the town council in that town. She ended up being other leaders in that town. All of that because she came back home to be there with my grandmother.
What's the name of that church? If you remember. Your story?
Cedar Grove.
Cedar Grove?
Cedar Grove. Cedar Grove United Methodist Church. Okay. And so it's changed now, Shay, because that was the original name, and then they changed it to something else. So, and my grandparents are buried there, but not, they were buried in another church about 10 miles out of Roland, because that's where they buried blacks. Okay, so now the church that they were going to, now they have their own cemetery, because that's where my aunt now is buried, there at that cemetery. So there were strong roots in Rowan. My grandparents are very, I mean, they were respected, and even to the point we talk about it now, and we talk about the fact that the church that they belonged to, because they couldn't pay the minister to be there 4 Sundays out of the month, he came there 2 Sundays out of the month and went to another church the other 2 Sundays. So between the two churches, that's how they were able to pay.
Sure.
And so my grandmother and my grandfather were like, we always said they ran the church, because when the minister came to town, you know, he would have to come by their house and pick up the key to be able to open the church. But at the same time, after church, where did he go? He sat at my grandparents' table.
Yeah.
Because they fed him. And so, anyway, so that's sort of my father's background, in a sense, as growing up, as a child growing up. And then, of course, when he graduated from Johnson C. Smith, then he did missionary work. And of course, he and my mother got married. Now, my mother and father got married secretly because my father was at Johnson C. Smith on scholarship. And you couldn't be on scholarship and be married.
Oh, wow.
So they got married his senior year in the seminary. And
what was it? Did they feel like at that point they weren't mature enough to marry? Do you know? Because you would think that marriage would be.
I have no idea.
Encouraged,
but because he was on scholarship, he couldn't get married, even though he said the president at the university at that time said to him, you know, I always thought that you were married, but I just couldn't prove it. Okay. So they, of course, you know, once he graduated from the seminary, my father did go back to Cheraw. And he did work there in that community. And that's where my 2 older brothers were born. Then he and my mother did missionary work as well. And then they left Cheraw and moved to Knoxville. And that's where we lived there. No, I have to go back, because now they left. Okay, let me back up. When they left South Carolina, they moved to Virginia, to a little town called Burkeville, Virginia. That's where I was born. And my father was still doing missionary work for the Presbyterian Church.
Do you know what church he was in Knoxville?
No, he was doing missionary work.
So the missionary work, what did that entail in Knoxville?
Well, they traveled to other churches, coaching ministers,
okay,
you know, those kinds of things. Right,
okay.
Right. So then, of course, I was born in Burkeville, Virginia. Burkeville is a very small town. I don't remember a lot about it, because we moved from Burkeville to Knoxville when I was maybe 1.5 years, 2 years old. But I just hear the stories that my brothers used to talk about. It was a very small town, and we lived in a house that was sort of like a duplex. 2 families lived in the house. People had pigs and, you know, that kind of stuff. And because my brother that's a year and a half older than I am, he would say, well, you know, I'm not scared of that big old hog. And he said, because the hog, you know, they would come through the yard, you know, because we lived like on a farm, more or less. And so we left Burkeville and then, of course, moved to Knoxville. We were there about 2 years. And then that's when we moved to Charlotte.
ask real quick. The names are so important. Your brother's names are.
Okay, my oldest brother is Herman Lacoste Counts Jr. He named after my father. The next brother is Wilson Edward Counts. Wilson has my mother's surname. Edward was her father's name. You know, back in those days, you named children after
Right.
relatives.
Right.
And then, of course, my name was Dorothy Geraldine Counts. Geraldine came from my father's sister, who died at a younger age.
Okay.
And then my youngest brother was Howard Algernon Counts. Algernon came from one of the professors at Johnson C. Smith. There was a colleague of my father's because he was born here in Charlotte.
Okay. So that's how that worked out.
Right.
So let me ask you this. It seems as if you were just always an intuitive child.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything in particular that you remember as a point of reference that says, you know, this history thing and learning about my family is something that I want to make sure that I retain for a long period of time, that made you very inquisitive to ask the questions or to pay deeper details to the things that was happening around you? Because as you say these stories, they're so vivid. You know what I'm saying? Whether it was passed down or just through your lived experience. And so what moment was it to where you can say, I can dial back to this, and then this is what, you know, kind of jump started things for me?
That came from my mother.
Okay.
Because my mother taught us at a young age that the most important thing is your family. So she was the storyteller for us as children growing up. Like you sit down, and now parents read books to children. My mother would sit down and tell us about our family and our history. For me, I have always been, I guess as a young child, a history buff. I majored in college, I majored in psychology and sociology, but I always enjoyed learning more about history, especially African American history.
Yeah.
And so a lot of us, and my mother continued to do that, not only with us, but she did that with her grandchildren. And her great grandchildren that she was able to experience before she died.
Sure.
So that's why we have that. First of all, that's why I say we have that close family history, because that came from my mother, and I have to believe that that's a part of her upbringing as well.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, through the years, my brothers would always say, well, if you want to know anything about the family, you need to go talk to Dot.
Yeah.
And I did, because I kept up with family, and I still do.
That's beautiful.
I was talking with a cousin this past weekend, and we talked about our family in the sense that I said, you know, Abe, when we grew up, a lot of people in black families have a lot of cousins. We didn't. And he said my mother and father had 4 children. My mother's brother had 2 children, and my mother's other brother had two boys, and my mother's sister had a boy and a girl. That's it. My father's family only had one. His half sister had 2 girls, and each one had a child. That's it.
Okay.
So now my family is depleted in a lot of ways. When you think of, there were 4 of us, and I'm the only one left. And then I have a cousin in California, one in Cincinnati, one in Hilton Head, and one at Cape Cod. So when we talk, I mean, I have second cousins and third cousins,
Right.
you know, on my mother's side. But in terms of first cousins, we had a small family.
Yeah.
So it wasn't hard for me to keep up with family members
Because it was such a tight
it was
unit.
such a tight knit family.
Yeah. So, and it in sitting down and talking with so many people who've done great things, we're always so humble as people, right? Most of us. You are an icon as it relates to the civil rights movement. I don't think that anybody that can Google civil rights and education, if you Google it, you're going to see your picture. It's just, it just happens, right? We know this. And so here you are, still living and breathing and still doing the good work into the community by educating people about humanity, about your lived experience and things like that. Has that even officially settled in for you yet, just how impactful your life has been? Or do you just look at it from the standpoint of you were doing the most humane thing to do at the time based on what your parents influenced you to do as well as their history?
I've always felt that I was God's servant.
Okay.
I was put on this earth to serve in any way that I could. Education happened to be the journey that I chose.
Mm-hmm.
And that journey was chosen because of my parents and because of my parents and my grandparents.
Right.
And so I never look at it in any other way. And I know growing up, I'd always said, I said that I wanted to do something for people. At first, I thought I wanted to be a nurse. And then when I got to college, I realized how much math and science I had to take. Then I said, that's not my chosen field. But at the same time, I have always been the caretaker. So that's still a part of serving. But the other part of it is my father was my mentor. As a child growing up, I saw the things that he did and for the people who he did it for. And I always said, I want to be just like my dad.
Mm.
So I think that's the other part of it.
Yeah.
And my father was the same way. My father was an humble man, and I know of a lot of students who came through this university who ended up living with us because they didn't have the money to come back to school the next semester or the next year. But my dad would say to them, you can live with us if you can get the money for your books and your tuition. So you don't have to worry about eating, you don't have to worry about having a place to live.
Right.
So there were students who were constantly in and out of our home as long as I can remember. Well, that's the kind of person my dad was. And my dad not only taught at the university, but later years in his life, he pastored 2 churches up in Concord. One was Cedar Grove Presbyterian Church, the other was Bethpage. And when he was there, it was the same kind of thing. The kinds of things he did for the people in that community. And I saw that. But I also saw things that he did for students on his campus. A lot of former alumni come to me and said, I wouldn't have made it through Johnson C. Smith if it hadn't been for your dad. Because my dad served on the disciplinary committee. So a lot of times what happens when kids would get in trouble and would normally be sent home, then he was going to give them another chance. I can think of how many people got married in our house.
Wow.
That were students of Johnson C. Smith. I mean, I'm just saying. So I saw all of those things. And I said, well, that's the kind of person that I want to be. So I knew my dad was doing that because my dad was one of God's servants. And so I chose the same life. And, people ask you, God, who's your mentor? So they expect you to say Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, what? And I say my dad. And people say, no, 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 no. I don't mean somebody in my family. I said, my dad. That's the person that I wanted to be like. And I feel that that's the, and my mother always said, you know, you're your father's child, you know, and I feel that you know, I've tried to do the same kind of work that he's done, and but that's who I am.
Well, it seems like throughout your family history, whenever opportunities came about, they took advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was your grandfather down in Rowan, whether it was your father going to Knoxville, going to Virginia, coming to Johnson C. Smith, et cetera, et cetera. You all were opportunists
Mm-hmm.
for the progression of the family unit. So then the big time came for you to
Mm-hmm.
take advantage of an opportunity, of course, to integrate Harding High School. What do you remember about the moment that you were asked or decided to integrate the high school?
Well, we had a in our family there was something that was mandated. I'll say now, then you didn't think in terms of being mandated, but it was required that every day at 5 o'clock we had to be home because that's when my father walked across the street from his office and we had dinner. And my mother, of course, she had dinner ready and we ate dinner as a family. And that's where conversations were held. And after my father naturally had grace, and then he would always say to you, well, how was your day? Which gave us an opportunity to discuss. So I say to people that that was one of the things that for me, I'm sure it could have happened in other black families as well back during those days. But that's the piece that I remember most because that's where we had conversations as a family. So what happened was when my father and mother were approached by the late Kelly Alexander as one of the families in Charlotte to test the system because it was 3 years after Brown, nothing had happened in Charlotte. So we're going to test the system. So you've got civil rights activists here like Reginald Hawkins and Kelly Alexander and Attorney White and all of them. These people were meeting together with each other, talking about what they were going to do.
Sure.
Okay? Now, all of them had children. So they're thinking in terms of their children as well. My father was a part of those conversations too. Now, you have to remember those conversations were held in each other's houses because they couldn't meet in other places because they had to make sure that the white community didn't see them coming together, or why all these black folks coming together, what they planned to do.
Absolutely.
So Kelly Alexander Sr. approached my father to be a part of that group. And then they decided that they would approach 20 families in Charlotte, throughout Charlotte, different backgrounds. Kelly's son, my parents, because Gus's parents, they worked in domestic services. They lived in over near, let's see, that has to be First Ward? Yeah, First Ward area. There were families in Brooklyn. So it was across Charlotte, and asked them would they consider making application for their children to attend predominantly white schools. There were 3 of us, and my youngest brother was at Seversville, which is now Bruns Academy, and I was graduating from Northwest Middle School, and Wilson was a senior at West Charlotte High School. So Dad applied for all 3 of his kids. And so we had that conversation at the table where we normally have conversations. And my dad explained it to us, asked us what we thought, but he also when he would ask those questions, he would give us the reasons why we should do something. It was our right. We deserve to have the right. He said he was a taxpaying citizen.
Absolutely.
He deserved to have the same type of education everybody else had. So naturally, those things, even though he would ask you, but he would share with you why he thought that we should do this. Well, naturally, we should say, well, that's right. So, I didn't think any more about it. The decision was made. I left Charlotte that July and went to Grinnell, Iowa in 1957 to a Presbyterian conference for youth from all over the world.
Multicultural.
Yeah. And we came, and they do it every 3 years. And all the youth from all over the world come together. Grinnell College was a Presbyterian school in Iowa. We left Charlotte and went to Iowa on the bus. Now, can you imagine a bus full of black kids from Charlotte, Gastonia, and the Concord area? All of us, as people used to say, Presbyterian kids, PKs, and took a bus out of Charlotte all the way to St. Louis, all the way to Iowa. We stopped one time and stayed in a black hotel in St. Louis, Missouri. We had to find black restaurants along the way that we could stop and eat. Other than that, back then you'd pack a lunch and you have food on, to eat along the way.
And that was something that just innately everyone knew what time it was in society.
Oh, yeah.
So
Now,
it didn't need to, it was normalized.
Yeah,
that this is
we knew that, we lived in a segregated world. We knew, and we were going to the Midwest, going to Iowa, of all places. But when we got to Grinnell, it was quite a difference because here you saw white young youth, Asian, kids from Jamaica, from all over that came together for this conference. So we were there for a week. And during that week was when my father-in-law got notice that I had been accepted at Harding. So I found that out after I came back. And so then that's when he said, what do you think? Well, the first thing, of course, I said, well, I'm going to miss my friends. My brothers had gone to West Charlotte. Naturally, I had looked forward to following them at West Charlotte High School. But at the same token, I knew that I was chosen for a reason. And so I didn't think much about it. So we went through the month of August, and of course, it's September the 4th when school started back then. And leading up to that time, we had conversations at the dinner table about it. But I wasn't aware that, my parents had gotten threatening calls and, things, other kinds of things. They sort of kept me away from that. They would say, I don't want you close to the window. I don't want you close to the door. I just didn't think about it then in terms of why. But they knew, they were trying to protect us as children to make sure nothing happened. So that morning, when I got up, in the picture, that a lot of people think that the man in the picture behind is my dad, but it was not. That was my dad's colleague. He was the dean of the seminary at Smith, Dr. Tompkins, and he came by the house that morning. And he said to my dad, do you need any help? And he said, well, I'm not sure what to expect. And so he said, maybe you just need to ride with me. So that's how he got in the mix in terms of, so that goes back to not only family support, but we lived in a community where you got community support.
What were your thoughts the night before everything took place?
Well, like I said earlier, I'm gonna miss my friends because for the last 9 years, I had been in the same school, with the same kids in the neighborhood I had grown up with. And yes, I was nervous because not knowing, meeting new. My thoughts were meeting new people because my
The
experience.
innocence in it is what
Yeah,
your
right.
thoughts were, just being a kid
Yeah,
and just
right.
okay.
Like I tell people, I guess I led a sheltered life because I was the only girl in my family. And my brothers took care of me. And they took care of me up until they died. I mean, it was that kind of family that I grew up in. You take care of each other. So I tell people I lived a sheltered life. And as I said, I was my daddy's child. And the same way with him, you know. So I guess I never really thought about the fact that what happened that morning would ever occur because I had not experienced anything like that in my life.
And what did occur that morning?
Well, when we left the house and went to Harding, and as we approached the entrance of the street going to Harding, it was barricaded. There were police barricades there, but there were police there. And so where you would normally drive down into the circle at Harding, my dad couldn't get there. So that's a 2-block walk from 5th Street to the entrance to the school. So my dad said to Dr. Tompkins, I need you to walk with her to make sure she's going to be okay because I need to find some place to park. And so he said to me, remember who you are? Remember you are inferior to no one. Hold your head up high. Be proud of who you are. And you can do anything that you want to do.
Hmm.
So those are the words, the last words I heard from my dad as I got out of the car. So as I proceeded to walk that 2 block to the auditorium of the school, the streets were lined with all these students. And see, Harding was 9 through 12, right? And so, but not only students, but they were adults. And that street at one time was lined with houses, and they were like 2-story homes with porches and stuff like that. And so people were on the porches, they were in the yards, they were in the street, you know. And so so naturally I was on the sidewalk. And so I proceeded to walk that walk to the auditorium. And the signs were made, using the N-word. I don't like to use that word, so I'll say the N-word. We know what it is. and saying, go back to Africa. We don't want you here. They were hollering out the same thing to me. And then, of course, they were pushing and shoving, and then they started throwing things. But there was a lady, her name was Miss Warlick, and she had formed a White Citizens Council when the announcement was made that Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools were going to integrate. And she pulled all these people together, and she said, we can't let these get in our schools. She happened to be at Harding that morning. She didn't go to Central. She didn't go to the middle school where Gus's sister and Dolores went. And so she came to Harding. Well, I know why she came to Harding. Because Harding, the population of the students at Harding were students who came from families who worked in the mills, who worked in the factories. So, and I would say, I came from a middle-income family. We struggled, but I came from a middle-income family.
Sure.
A lot of these kids' parents didn't have professional jobs. So that was the population of students at Harding. So she came there because I'm sure she figured that she could get more going there than she could downtown at Central. So that's when she was telling the girls, don't let her get through that door. Spit on her. And that's when they did. And I continued to, what my dad said, hold my head up, be proud of who I am, and continue that walk. But I kept my eyes on the door, because I said, if I can get inside, everything is going to be okay. And that was not necessarily true, because once I got inside, it continued to happen. And so the principal called all sophomores to come up front and sit in, because when I first went in the auditorium, I had to find a vacant seat because the kids were still following me and doing all kinds of gestures and doing all kinds of things. And so he didn't say anything. They were teachers lined up along the hallway, in the auditorium. They didn't do anything. So I sat down by myself at first, and then he called all sophomores to come up front. And I came up front and sat with the other sophomores, and that's when they would assign you to go to a homeroom class. And when you went to your homeroom class, you'd go there to pick your schedule and pick up books. And so I went to mine. Mine was right on the other side of the principal's office. So that's where they had put me. And when I walked, I remember walking in that class, and there were 3 adults standing there talking to each other. And it's like I didn't even exist. So I got through that. And that afternoon, they let us out at 12 o'clock, because all you had to do was go pick up your, that morning, pick up your schedule, pick up your books, and then you could go home, and then you come back the next day for a full day. Well, that was on Thursday. I woke up Friday morning, and I had a very high fever.
Can I ask real quick, what was the conversation Thursday night during dinner?
Well, my parents asked me, how did the day go?
Okay.
And I explained to them, once I got inside. I mean, my father basically knew, and I'm sure he had shared that with my mom, in terms of, because the other thing I found out later was while he was waiting for Dr. Tompkins to come back to the car, that the car was surrounded, and they were, how people rock the car trying to, right. Police was standing there, nothing. So I'm sure he had shared that with my mom. Well, I can say that my mom always said that she had, she was afraid. This was her daughter, right? But she knew that why this had to be done, So anyway, I told them, once I got inside the auditorium, what happened in the classrooms. When I went to the classroom, I was ignored. They didn't say anything to me at all. But what happened was my dad came to pick me up. But I don't know whether you've heard of Dr. Hawkins. That's Donnell's uncle.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that.
Reginald Hawkins. Reginald Hawkins was a big civil rights activist in this town. He was a dentist, but he was also a Presbyterian minister. He ran for governor. So go look him up and you'll see. But anyway, so he was a friend of my dad's. My dad had taught him in the seminary. He was also a dentist. We lived in the same neighborhood. And so he came with my dad that afternoon to pick me up. So there's a picture of him walking with me leaving school that afternoon.
Okay.
So that goes back to community support and family support, okay? So Friday, my dad went down to the school, and he talked to Dr. Hawkins, and was the principal at Harding, and he said, I need to let you know that my daughter will be back on Monday. She's running a high fever, and the doctor has suggested she not come to school. If there are any assignments that would have been given out to her today, I'd like to have those, and at least she can work on those over the weekend. When I went back to school on Monday, guess what? No clouds, nobody standing outside. And so when I walked in the building, they were shocked. Now the principal knew, But to our knowledge, he hadn't told anybody else. So that was Monday. The same kinds of things that happened on Thursday, being ignored by teachers, being pushed in the hallways by the kids, and then going up and down the steps, the stairwells and those kinds of things. So that was Monday. On Tuesday, there was a young lady who sat next to me that first day who had just recently moved to Charlotte. Her family lived in this area, and that was her first day at Harding as well.
Is that I think I remember the last time we spoke, she came from Winston?
Yes, moved here from Winston-Salem. Her parents had moved here from Winston-Salem. And so, she and I struck up a conversation. So even though I was being ignored by the adults and other students, that at least I felt I had one person I could talk to.
Sure.
So that was on Tuesday. So when I went home, I was excited to tell my parents.
Got a
Of course,
friend.
at least now I got a friend. I've got somebody who's in the same situation I'm in. We're new students at the school and whatever.
What was her name? Do you remember?
I cannot
Can't remember her name? Okay.
So that was Tuesday. So I went to Wednesday, the same kinds of things were going on. Every time, I would see Dr. Hawkins out in the hallways, like, when kids are doing changing classes, a lot of times teachers stand out in the hallways, and he'd always be standing there, at his door. And a lot of times, he'd see things, he'd just turn around and go back inside. So I was sitting in the cafeteria, and I was sitting at the table by myself. But what happened that morning, I saw the young lady as I was walking. We passed in the hallway, and she dropped her head, and I knew what it was. So when I went to lunch, then of course I was by myself, and I was sitting there eating lunch, and a group of boys surrounded the table, and they spat in my food. I picked up my tray, put it on the conveyor belt, and I walked outside. I saw her, but I knew that something wasn't right. And so when I went home that evening, I shared that every day. My parents would ask me the question, what do you think? And I kept saying, it's going to get better. Things are going to get better. Once they get to know who I am, things are going to be better. Because I truly believe that. And so on Wednesday, I told my mom and dad, I said, well, school will allow you to go out for lunch, and you can go home for lunch as long as you're back for your afternoon classes. Can you all pick me up tomorrow? Because I told them about the spitting in my food. And I said, a lot of things I can tolerate, but I have to eat. So my dad said, well, someone will pick you up. We're not sure who it will be because, naturally, he's working. And he said, well, someone will pick you up. We'll get you picked up tomorrow. So when I left for school on Thursday morning, then, I knew that somebody was going to come and pick me up at lunchtime. So as I said, Thursday mornings were the same. I sat in the back of the class. I raised my hand. It's like I didn't exist. And so when I went to my locker and I was standing in the hallway, as I said, my locker was right next to his office as well as my homeroom. And I was standing there, and all of a sudden I felt this sharp object in the back of my head. And then my back, and it was a blackboard eraser hit me in the back. And I turned around and I looked, because every time something happened, it was always a group of kids. And you couldn't say who did it.
One person did it, right.
Because they were always in a group. So I put my books in the locker. I got my jacket, and I proceeded to the front door to go out the door. And when I opened the door to go out the door, my dad's car was parked in a circle. and the back window was shattered. And that's the first time I was afraid. Because now, the kinds of things they were doing to me inside, now the target was my family.
Yeah, it escalated.
Right. And I wasn't sure who was in the car. But as I got closer to the car, my brother, my oldest brother, got out. And he was in New York. And he picked up the New York Times. And he saw his sister's picture on the front page. And he said, I need to go home. So he caught the train, came home. Of course, he didn't tell my parents or any of us, we didn't know. And so naturally that morning, that was the person that my dad sent to pick me up. So when we got home, then he said, you need to tell Mom and Dad what happened. And that was my last day at Harding. My dad called the police chief, the superintendent. At that time, it was Superintendent Garinger, was the superintendent of schools here in Charlotte. And he called him, and he said, let them know what the kinds of things that had been going on. And the superintendent says, well, I've gotten no reports from the school. And the police chief, he asked him, he said, I need to know if my daughter is going to be safe. Can I depend on you to make sure that nothing happens to my child?
Mm-hmm.
And they said, we cannot guarantee her safety. And that was all he needed. So then he, called everybody together, had the conversation again, and then that's when he decided to do a press conference and called in the media and made his famous speech that he was taking me out of Harding. And so then the decision was, what happens next? Because now schools had started. This was in September. But my parents did not want me to go to a Charlotte. Not because they felt where Charlotte was inferior.
Right.
But because I had had an experience, and they wanted me to experience a situation where it wasn't a segregated situation. Because my dad said, everybody's not the same. So we wanted to make sure that I went somewhere where I went to an integrated environment. I had an aunt and uncle that lived in Philadelphia, and an aunt and uncle that lived in Yeadon, Pennsylvania. And if you know anything about suburban Philadelphia, you got all Bryn Mawr and all these little suburban areas, okay? Yeadon was a prestigious community outside of Philadelphia where a lot of professional Black families lived. Entertainers, doctors, lawyers. My aunt and uncle lived in that community. So that's where they sent me to live with Aunt Virgie and Uncle Ed. And I finished out the year at the high school there.
So you had 2 years in Philadelphia.
One
year in Philadelphia.
I finished out my sophomore year there.
Okay.
And living with them. But I said to my parents, can I be closer to home? Because I miss my family.
Sure.
Even though I was living with family and I had, family in Philadelphia, but I miss my family. And my parents decided that I could come home, and they had looked into options of private schools. So I went to Allen High School in Asheville, North Carolina.
I'm familiar with that high school.
Are you?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but anyway, and that's where I finished my last 2 years at Allen. But Allen was run by the Methodist Church. My grandmother, and grandfather were Methodists, so they were familiar with it. And so my parents decided that that's where I needed to go. So that's where I went, and that's where I finished.
I'm always amazed just by how vivid I mean, it's like literally, I sat down here and watched a movie. I don't know, Shay, if you felt the same. Like I was just at the movie with no popcorn
Well,
and
I'm a
no soda.
storyteller.
Right, right.
I'm a
So
storyteller.
obviously, your lived experience fueled post school studies, how you've navigated throughout the world. Can you talk about how much of everything that you just told us in that movie just kind of naturally flows into when you're in community speaking, whether it's mentoring, et cetera, et cetera? How much of this is just very easy for you to talk about? Because the innocence that you had mentioned, right? Like, I just went to school just so I can meet new friends and I did this. It's not that you were oblivious to what was happening in the world around you. It's just this consistent optimistic view in the world that you have that's amazing to me. So how did you draw the two parallels?
Well, one of the things that I decided after my experience at Harding and what happened to me, I decided that whatever I did in life, at that time I'm 15, I wasn't sure what I was going to do then. But whatever I did in life, I was going to make sure that didn't happen to another child, what happened to me. So I think that's when for me, that's when things started. And as I said, my experience at Harding, for some people, would have been a negative experience. But I always consider that, for me, a positive experience. Because what it did is, that was my career path started then. So when I graduated, of course, I came to Johnson C. Smith, graduated with a degree in psychology and sociology. I left Charlotte because I was ready to leave home then. And I moved to New York. And the reason why I moved to New York was because I had relatives in New York. My father's sister was there, my mother's brother and his wife were there, and I had cousins. And I knew I could be there, and at least I had family. So now it's time for me to get out on my own and decide what actually I'm going to do. Well, when I left Charlotte, I didn't know what I was going to do when I moved to New York. There were a lot of, at first I had talked about possibly going to the Peace Corps, but I said, no, before I do that, I need to experience some other things first. And so when I went to New York, several of my friends that I was in school with here at Smith were also in New York. And there was a place in New York, it was in Spanish Harlem, 105th Street, and it was a center for children that had been abused. And they had one section for babies up to age 6, and then it had another section for kids 7 up through high school. And so that was the first job I got. And I was working in there as a counselor, and I was working the night shift. So I'd go to work at midnight and get out 7 o'clock in the morning. That program was under the Department of Social Services. And those of you who lived in the North know that everything is in a union. So back then, you know, you went on strike, then you don't cross the picket line. I didn't know anything about picketing. I didn't know anything about unions. I came from the South.
Right.
So I shared that with my parents, and my dad said to me, my dad was not very happy about me leaving Charlotte because I was his daughter. I mean, he wanted me to be here. And so he said, don't, and I told him what was going on. And he said, don't you cross that picket line. And I said, why? He said, Doc, it's not safe. Don't you cross that picket line. I said, you know, I have an apartment. I was sharing it with 2 other girls. And I said, you know, I have to eat, I have to do this and whatever. And he said, well, we'll send you the money, but don't you cross that picket line. So my mother's brother and his wife, I lived in the lower Bronx down near Yankee Stadium, and they lived in the upper part of the Bronx. And they said, I guess my mother and dad had called them, and they came. They said, you can come and live with us, because they had like a basement apartment in their house. So I went to live with my Uncle Tom and Aunt Jerry, and she was working in a preschool program. And so I needed a job. So she got me a job working in a preschool program in the Upper Bronx, and that's when my career in early childhood started. So I did that, and then of course I got married, and then my husband wanted to go back to school, and we thought it'd be best to come back south rather than trying to do that in New York. And we didn't want to get caught up in New York, because I know what happens a lot of times. You get in places like that, all of a sudden you're there and you'll never get out. And so we came back to Charlotte, and that was in the late 60s. And things here in Charlotte, a lot had not changed. Some things had changed from 1957, but a lot had not changed. And so when I came back here, he ended up going to UNC Charlotte for a semester. And then he decided he was going to change, and he ended up coming to Johnson Smith, graduated from Johnson Smith. And what happened was I went to work for Eastern Airlines. And the reason for that was because I looked into applying for a job in the school system. Now, what they were paying teachers was nothing compared to what they paid at Eastern. All my friends were going to work at Eastern, because Eastern were offering these jobs and reservations. You had the opportunity to fly, you could have all these benefits. So I went to work for Eastern. And I worked for Eastern for 2 years. And then my husband and I adopted our first child. And then, of course, I came home, and then we adopted our second child within 4 months later, and then I became a stay-at-home parent. And then when I went back to work in a preschool program in Charlotte, and the rest is history.
Yeah.